Hi everybody, welcome to Storytime with Angel. Today we're going to be reading from my dining room again. Spring in the Northeast is a little unpredictable, and March especially, since we're in late March. It's still not warm enough to go out to the sunroom where the light is better. So my apologies once again for the kind of wonky lighting. Today we're going to be talking about Magic's Muse from Anne Barwell. And this is the second book in her Hidden Places series. This is from Dream Spinner Press. I'm going to have both of the covers and the links down below on the blog. The first book was Cat's Quill, and then the second one is Magic's Muse. And Anne says that she is working on book 3, which is one word, which she actually says is a side story to book 1. So that sounds really interesting. But right now we're going to be doing an excerpt from Magic's Muse. This is gay fantasy, and it is already out there, so you can pick it up. Dream Spinner Press and all other lovely distribution points. Let's do the blurb first. And our blurb for Magic's Muse reads, Thomas and Cathal have escaped from Nauru, Cathal's mystical homeworld, but happily ever after is never as straightforward in real life as it is in books. Then again, most people don't deal with the complication of a lover who's magically bonded to a tree or have an interfering cat for a cousin. With Nauru's police force, the Falcon's still after Cathal, he can't go home. Now that he and Thomas have consummated their relationship, Cathal's abilities are evolving and changing to the point that Thomas can sense them. And until the oak portal closes, Cathal and his new life with Thomas are in limbo, as Cathal can't expect Thomas to stay with someone who can never venture past the property line. Will he and Thomas ever get to follow through on their engagement? Alrighty. And the excerpt that we're going to read here, we have Ethan's friend who's talking to Cathal. And in Cat's Quill, Thomas disappears for 6 weeks with no clue as to where he's gone. And he'd followed Cathal across worlds through an enchanted portal tied to an old oak tree. So Ethan, who's the friend, is more of a factual kind of guy, Anne says, and he doesn't believe in magic, so Cathal decides that he needs to give him some proof. Unfortunately, Cathal is still tied to the portal by an enchantment and trying to venture past the boundaries of the spell. Unfortunately, this has consequences. So, we start with Ethan speaking. My apologies, he said stiffly. It won't happen again. But you still don't believe me. Would you, in my position? You turn up, my best friend, who's never shown any interest in anyone male or female, suddenly falls for you, then both of you disappear for 6 weeks. Ethan began counting off on his fingers, scaring and worrying several people in the process, I might add. You're not exactly gaining brownie points here. Shall I go on? Please do. If they got this out in the open, they could at least attempt to work through it and move forward. Otherwise, this was going to be a very unpleasant visit for all of them. Ethan was trying to protect the people he cared about, and the explanations he'd been given went against the beliefs with which he was raised. His reaction was understandable, even though it would not be easily smoothed over. Thomas might have been able to find your precious portal and follow you, but what about those of us stuck here not knowing where the hell either of you were, or whether you were still alive? Logically, I still don't believe in the thing, but the more I think about it, the more it appears to be the only explanation, Occam's razor and all that. Ethan paused to snatch a breath. If you were so worried about him, why the fuck did you leave him a way through? It doesn't make any sense. So Ethan did believe it existed, despite his words to the contrary. He was angry, and rightly so. I didn't. Cathal had not intended for Thomas to follow. I gave myself up to the Falcons so that they would leave him here. It might be forbidden to take someone from this world through the portal into Nauru, but the falcons who had come for him were not working for the king. Darren's interests always colored her interpretation of the law, and if she had already discovered Cathal's intentions towards Thomas, that would have overridden all else. Christian left the flute for him to find after I dropped it. That would be the guy who is a cat. A vein in Ethan's forehead twitched. Cathal nodded. See how crazy this all sounds? If I went to the authorities with any of it, they'd drag me off in a straitjacket. Sometimes the answer is the one in front of you, even if it's difficult to believe. Cathal remembered how he'd felt when Uncle Alden told him that the stories about this world were real. Doesn't even a part of you still believe in magic, Ethan? I don't know. Ethan's expression flattened to an emotionless mask. Show me some proof, Cathal. Something I can see, rather than stories that I can't believe. Cathal bit his lip, considering his options. Neither his nor Will's abilities manifested themselves in ways that could be seen. Christian's did, but that wasn't really an option at the moment. With the mood his cousin was in, it was doubtful he would be very cooperative even if it were suggested. There might be a way, but it was risky, and Thomas would not be happy. But then Thomas would not be happy knowing Ethan was upset by this, because he couldn't bridge the distance between his science and the reality of magic. I'll do what I can, Cathal said slowly. Whether you see it as proof or not is up to you, but it's all I can offer. He glanced toward the tree and then at Thomas's ring, whispering a mental apology to his betrothed. It's not my intention to upset you, Ethan, or cause trouble between you and Thomas. I know he considers you a close friend and holds you in high regard. They were in this world now, and yet he was still not free from the reach of his own. He had no past here, at least not one he could prove. The false identity papers would help, but those such as Ethan would always see them for what they were, a fabrication to hide a world that was only usually glimpsed or whispered about by the inhabitants of this one. He holds you in high regard, too. Ethan offered a small branch of what had the potential to be friendship. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't have said all of this, but I tend to speak my mind. I always have. I have very little patience for people who hide things, as I tend to figure it's usually not for a good reason. I've only hidden things to keep those I care about safe. Cathal took several deep breaths as they walked out the front gate. Nothing happened. He was being foolish. He'd already ridden farther, and his leash bound him to the original boundaries of the property, not the existing ones. The grass in the next field was damp after the previous night's rainfall. This particular field had always been empty, even in Alice's time. But in the one beyond, there was a man-made structure approximately a foot high. It was rectangular in shape, but had an oval roof. It was an unusual-looking thing, not made by nature but by man. With its roof of speckled, mossy stone propped up by 2 pillars at each end, it was reminiscent of a tiny church. It still stood guard, as it always had done, marking the boundary between Alice's lands and those of her neighbor. The road to hell is meant to be paved with good intentions, Ethan reminded him, walking on a little head of the fence separating the 2 fields. There was a stile directly in front of them, so they wouldn't have to climb the fence itself. What's done is done, Ethan. I can't change what actions I've taken in the past, but I can remember them for the future and hope that I don't make the same mistakes again. Cathal loosened the top button of his jacket. The air was growing heavier, but that was to be expected, even if the low hum that accompanied it was not. Bees, he mumbled. It sounded like bees. What? Ethan looked around. Where? I can't see anything. Had he said that aloud? It was nothing. He pointed toward the boundary marker. Look, we're almost there. What is that thing? Ethan peered into the distance. Cathal scratched at his wrist. I've always presumed that it was made by someone with a sense of humor. It's a boundary marker, but apart from that, I don't know. He felt a touch of cold against his face, a brush of ice against his mind. It was a warning. He'd felt it enough to recognize it as such, but it didn't make sense. The boundary marker hadn't moved. He peered at it, making sure. He was nervous after last time. That had to be it. In the distance, the old oak's branches groaned as though protesting a strong wind, yet here the grass did not bend. In fact, it barely moved. There is probably a good reason for it being as it is. There usually is. Ethan climbed the stile, waiting at the other side for Cathal to join him. He followed Cathal's gaze, his brow creased in thought. There is usually a good reason for most things. Cathal began to climb, swayed, and grabbed at the stile to steady himself. Why was it suddenly so hot? He'd been freezing only moments before. His breath wheezed as he struggled to fill his lungs. He heard his voice faintly as though from a distance. It was croaky. His throat hurt. Suddenly his surroundings spun, his vision darkening. He felt himself falling forward over the fence, tried to stop but couldn't. The ground came up to meet him, the grass hard and wet underneath him as he hit with a thud. The buzzing noise grew louder, almost deafening. He edged back toward the fence, trying to escape the darkness. It reached for him. His stomach churned and he tasted bile. This shouldn't be happening. Not yet. He wasn't at the boundary. "Are you okay?" Ethan sounded calm, but waves of concern rolled off him, building to almost panic. He reached for Cathal, trying to help, but not sure how. Cathal shook his head, trying to form the words, but he couldn't catch his breath. The sleeve of his coat rode up to reveal his tattoo. It was a fiery red, burning to almost black. No, this wouldn't happen again. He wouldn't allow it. The enchantment tightened. He clawed at his throat, pulling away from Ethan, and tried to crawl back the way he'd come. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The darkness reached for him again. He shuddered, tried to find the energy within to fight it, but couldn't. He was tired, too tired. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I tried to keep my promise. I love you." All right. It's pretty exciting stuff. That's Magic's Muse by Anne Barwell. That is available from Dream Spinner Press. I'll have all the nice linkages and covers and stuff down below for you. Thanks again for stopping by to listen, and we'll have another story for you on Thursday. Thanks for coming.